Thank you for being here tonight. Have any of you ever been faced with a life or death decision and not very much time to make it? Not only a decision that would affect you, but the people that are with you. This story took place July 31st, 1944, Devick, England, at the Royal Air Force Base. The crew had been alerted the night before that they would have a bombing mission the following morning, so it was important that they got to bed early and got plenty of rest and sleep. 4 o'clock they were awakened, had a hearty breakfast. They went to their first briefing, the mission briefing, and it was at that briefing that they found out where they would be flying that day. Their bombing target that day was deep in the Rhine Valley, an industrial complex outside of Cologne. Then they went to their plane and they had the flight check, and then they got in the queue ready to take off. It was a pretty normal day, as days goes. About 60 degrees, overcast, humid. Nothing exceptional, except there's nothing ordinary about a bombing mission. These are young men who had volunteered to serve their country. And they all knew that on any given mission, it was quite likely that some of their colleagues would not come back. Death was a way of life. So as they began to take off, they would take off at 30-second intervals, and then the planes would circle, circle, circle in a flight pattern, not unlike some of the ones you've been in waiting to land or take on your journey. But they would circle until all 36 planes were airborne, at which point they would set off for their target. A normal mission for this crew of B-24s was about 4 to 6 hours, so they were equipped fuel-wise for that length of mission. Everything went okay for a while, and then they encountered an unpredicted, unexpected, extraordinary thunderstorm. As a part of this thunderstorm, they lost visual contact with each other, but they also lost radio contact. The one particular plane just continued flying because they were on a mission and nothing would be stopping them. And as they broke through and got through the storm and on the other side, they realized they still couldn't see any of the 35 other planes that they had left with. Nobody wants to be out there alone, but they were. What they didn't know that the 35 other planes had all turned back and returned to base. They had no way of knowing that. They were on a mission. They were going to fly it. As they continued on toward their intended target, they saw ahead of them another group of planes, so they were able to join in with that group and participate in part of that group's mission, drop a lot of their bombs, but they also learned that this group was on a much longer, deeper mission into Europe, a mission that was about 9 hours, and they only had fuel for 4 to 6. So there's no way they could continue outbound with them and then come back. That was not an option. So they turned back. As they turned back and they were recalculating how they're going to get back and their fuel and their payload and all the things that navigators and pilots and engineers do, they realized it was unlikely that they had enough fuel to make it home. So what are we going to do now? There are a lot of ways to make decisions. So the engineer and the navigator put their head together and said, well, if we do this, this, and this, and this, and this, we might make it. But we don't know for sure. This is the best guess. So what was the alternative? Well, the alternative would be to land in Switzerland. They were only 30 miles away. They could see the white caps of the Alps. Switzerland was a neutral country, They, if they chose to go to Switzerland, would be interred for the remainder of the war, because Switzerland, though neutral, was heavily under German influence. And their biggest concern about internment wasn't the idea that they were prisoners but not prisoners, but that they would not be able to serve their country. But it was a viable option. They had plenty of fuel to get to Switzerland. So the pilot needed to make a decision. A lot of ways people can make decisions. They can just say, this is what we're doing. You can flip a coin. You can have a long debate, discussion. Or we can, in a democracy, take a vote. This pilot chose to take a vote. The men were told, these are the facts, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. Flight engineer says, we might make it, what do you want to do? Each man, one vote. 6-4. We're going to do everything we can to get back to our base. So, they put the plan into motion. And what that included was offloading every single thing in the plane, not bolted down except themselves. They were very careful to not start throwing things out until they were over open water, because they didn't want anything to fall into enemy hands. This included guns. This included ammunition. This included any food they might have. This even included the parachutes that they had packed in case they needed to jump out of the plane. This was an all or none proposition. And they were all in. I wonder what that must have been like in that continued flying, in that drone of background, knowing that the die was cast, the decision was made, but there was no knowing for sure how it would play out. What do men think about when they might be in the last hours of their life? What do they think about? What do they talk about? Very little, because at that point, this was an inward journey. Everybody had bought into this, including the 4 who didn't choose it. But it was all men together. The engineer and the navigator got them at about an altitude of 28,000 feet, and they went into a long glide. Their biggest worry was flying at that altitude, being spotted as a lone eagle, which would have been a very, very easy target. So they would imagine themselves invisible. As they flew across Europe, I can imagine there was some prayer. You know, they say there are no atheists in foxholes. I don't think there are any at 28,000 feet on a glide path with insufficient fuel to get home either. And then they saw it. Heaven on earth. They saw their base. Lined up perfectly with the runway, landed perfectly, and as soon as they touched down, all 4 engines died at the same time. They had to be towed off the runway. There was no way to even drive the plane off. And then each man to a man got off the plane, congratulating each other, especially the flight engineer and the navigator. And on all 4s, each man went down and kissed the ground. When the mechanics came out to check out the plane, they used their dipstick in the engines and in fuel tanks to measure them. 4 fuel tanks, each one bone dry. These men truly did come home on 2 wings and a prayer. This story was shared with me by my friend John Wagner, who was the ball turret gunner on that flight. That's the person that sits in the bubble underneath the plane to make sure that the landing gear is up and down. And he has virtually a bird's eye view of everything happening. And my friend John celebrated his 90th birthday this past Sunday, so I dedicate this story to John.